Hello Year 11, it's Mrs Jones here. Today we're going to have a walk through Paper 2 together. You'll sit this exam on Wednesday the 14th of June in the afternoon. This exam tests how has British society changed 1890 to 1918. The exam lasts an hour and a half. I'll talk you through the timings very soon. Again, as soon as you get the booklet, you're going to read through the front page and make sure that you understand it. For this paper, it's quite simple. You answer all the questions, and there will be 5 questions. The total number of marks is 53, and question 5 has 3 additional marks for spelling. This is the exam paper that has a flap. So when you get the booklet, you're going to need to open the flap. It will say fold out this page, and then you'll be able to read the questions on page 3. Okay, in this example, we're going to use the specimen paper, which was released before the exam started to be examined, because there's only 2 past papers and we've looked at them both in lesson. So, as you know, it's really important when you're in the exam that you read through the information at the top of the page. So, it'll say something along these lines. How has British society changed 1890 to 1918? In answering the questions, you'll need to use your knowledge of British society 1890 to 1918 to interpret and evaluate the sources. When you are asked to use specific sources, you must do so, but you may also use any of the other sources if they are relevant. Your answer to question 5 should be largely based on your knowledge of British society 1890 to 1918, but you should also use the sources, and we'll come back to that. But it's really important that you remember that this is a knowledge paper and you're being examined on your knowledge as well as how you can use the sources. Please make sure, as it says, that you answer all the questions. Okay, so before we get started, let's just have a general run through on the timings. So as you can see, some of the questions require you to use 2 sources, some of them just 1. When you see a question that requires you to use 2 sources, please spend about 15 minutes on this type of question. When it's just 1 source, you should spend about 10 minutes. And for the last question, you should be spending about 30 minutes. So on this paper, you'd spend 30 minutes on this question, 15 minutes on this one, 10 minutes on this one, 10 minutes on this one, and 15 minutes on this one. That'll give you about 10 minutes in order to go through the sources and annotate them. Okay, so let's start off by thinking about how do you annotate the sources then. In this paper, you'll generally get A to E, so obviously 5 sources. This one has 2 written sources to start with that you're going to be asked to compare, a cartoon, another cartoon, and then 2 more written sources. This one's got 6 sources instead of 5. And again, you'll be asked to compare the 2 written sources. It will not always be like this. Sometimes you'll be asked more single questions. For example, last year's paper, there were 3 questions that were about 1 source and 1 question that were about 2 sources. So there's no general rule about that. Also, the types of questions are quite different on each of the 3 papers we have to compare. You're not always going to be asked the same type of questions. So when we go through the types of questions, we'll think carefully about how do you approach each different one, what should you be prepared for. So, we're going to start off by annotating a cartoon. So we'll look at this one in the specimen paper, which is source D. Okay, so the first thing that you do when you're annotating a source like this is you think about what is the nature, origin and purpose. The nature of this source is that it is a cartoon. The origin is from a British magazine in August 1916. And then we need to look at the source carefully to work out the purpose. Before we do anything else, we know that it's going to have a focus on World War I because obviously it's from 1916 and the dates of World War I go 1914 to 1918. You also know that she's a war worker because of what it says. So the next thing that I do is I look at the source from corner to corner, down the bottom, and then across each way, and just look for details as I'm looking at it. So I can see that they are both working in a munitions factory, the 2 people in it. Obviously this is a woman. Interestingly, she's got trousers on, and they've made a point of letting me see she's got trousers on. I can see that maybe he looks a little bit grumpy, so I might kind of circle his face. And most importantly, I'm going to read the little bit at the bottom, the the sort of caption of the source, and you'll notice that you're given some clues as to how to interpret the source down here with the definitions that it gives you. So, the war workers. What's all this cackle about votes and a new register? Don't know or care, we're all too busy just now. So, I can infer that the first one is the man speaking and the second one is the woman speaking. The fact that it's called the war workers implies that they're kind of on equal footing. They're both wearing trousers. I think that's significant. The silly chatter is what cackle means. So the man is implying that the women are having silly chatter about voting in a new register. And the woman is saying, oh, I don't know or care, I'm too busy working right now to care. So it's showing that the woman is really serious about her war work. So the purpose of the source then is to convince people that women are serious and they are focused on their war work, and therefore they deserve the vote because they're taking the war really seriously and making a big contribution. So when you're looking at sources like this, you're looking for clues, you're thinking carefully about the tone of the source. Can you work out whose side it's on from the sort of language that it uses? For me, the word in this that really showed it was the word cackle, and then the fact that the woman is being so sensible. It's clearly sympathetic towards women. Okay, so that's how we go about annotating the sources. So if we go back to the paper, what I would do in those 10 minutes that I'm trying to spend annotating the sources and understanding the paper, I would actually first of all read through each question and think about what is it asking me. So for example, as I was going through, I might highlight the word similar, and I might go through this one and say, why was the source published? I might just note down the word purpose because that's what's asking me. What is the message of the source? Just the message is obviously the key bit of that question. Is source E more typical of women's experience of work during the First World War than source F? For this one, I'm going to underline the word typical, and then I'm going to put women's experience of work. And obviously I'm comparing the two sources, so I might put the word compare. And then for here, I'm thinking, okay, so the question I'm being asked is women were respected during the period of 1890 to 1918. And I need to have that in mind as I'm going through the process of annotating all the sources. So I then spend the next 10 minutes going through each source, annotating them, and thinking about the question that I've been asked about the sources as I go along. I might even, as I go through, think about, does this one show anything about respecting women or not respecting women, etc. That way, when I get to the point of actually answering the questions, I've already done a lot of the thinking, which will make answering the questions much quicker. Okay, so let's just go through this paper question by question and talk through how you would approach each one. So, study source A and B. How similar are these two sources? You might want to pause so that you can read through the sources now. Straight away, it's clear that both of the sources are asking for votes for women so that women can improve their conditions and their rights in general. However, one is from a group of women workers, the other is from the Suffragette Journal. So the Suffragette Journal is obviously going to be mainly thinking about the fact that they want the vote, and this argument is a way to get them the vote. Whereas this one, the purpose of it is to get better rights, and getting the vote is perhaps a way that they can improve their condition. So their point of view is slightly different, even though they both want the same thing. Okay, so this is the mark scheme for this question. As you can see, it's out of 9 marks. You might want to pause it again to read the description here on the right of a model answer. Okay, so as you can see over here, the level 5 and level 4 descriptors are very similar. What you need to do is you need to be fully interpreting both sources in context to explain the differences between them. And what that means is essentially that you need to say clearly what the purpose of each source is in this instance. So source A is from a working class campaign in order to improve women's rights in that particular situation. So the purpose is to improve their working conditions, whereas source B is for the wider campaign to get votes for women, and therefore it's been the working rights are thrown in with other more middle class concerns such as being able to divorce husbands instead of husbands being able just to divorced wives. So more equal rights in that field. And that's explained really well in the second paragraph. In most questions like this, it is really purpose that you're being asked to compare, or perhaps the origin of the source, or if the source is from a particular type of thing, like maybe a manifesto or a political speech, it's going to have an angle on it. And what you're really being asked to do is to say, what do they have in common in the first paragraph? And then in the second paragraph, you then need to say why they are different, and there will be a reason that they are different. It will probably be to do with the purpose, but it could also be to do with the content, and you need to check that against your knowledge for both sources. So it's really important that you've got the similarities in the first paragraph and mention both sources, and then in the second paragraph you clearly say why they are different and give evidence from each source for the reason you think they are different, and really try to find perhaps a purpose or something about the nature or origin that makes them very different, because that's what this question wants you to do. Question 2 is, why was this source published in 1908? This type of question usually comes up in the exam. It has for the past 2 years. Why was this source published at this time? And why was this source published at this time? So you're very likely to get a question that says, why was this source published in a particular year or at this time? This question is really nice. It's basically saying, what is the purpose of publishing this source at this particular time? So you're being asked to say what the purpose is and what you know specifically about the time that explains why that would be the purpose. Okay, so this is the source that goes with that question. This cartoon is one that you're probably familiar with. This is the house that man built. It has a satirical poem. And these are a few of the women of note who say that they want and they will have the vote, and think that they ought to have man's support, even although he should have to go short. The sly suffragette who is all on the get and wants all in the house that man built. A postcard published in 1908. Clearly, this is against votes for women. You can tell by the way they've drawn the women. They've made them look a little bit crazy, a little bit manly, and the man looks very together and contrasting to the women at the back. Obviously, the house that man built is Parliament, and women clearly, according to this postcard, don't belong in Parliament because they didn't build it, and they're being silly to ask for the vote, and actually being quite selfish. And then underneath, just to point out the nature, origin, purpose, it's a postcard. It doesn't say that it's published in Britain, but it's clearly published in Britain, and it's 1908, so the campaign for women's suffrage is already in swing. So let's have a look at the mark scheme for this question. The first thing you'll notice is that the model answer for this one is really short, and there really is no reason why you would have to write more than one good paragraph on this question. Again, you might want to pause now and have a look through the answer and just make sure that you have understood what's good about this answer. Okay, if you have a look at the level 4 and level 5 here, the difference is quite significant. So this one's looking for sophisticated knowledge of what was going on at the time. So a really simple answer that's not as good as the one that's on the screen might be something like, the source was published in 1908 to turn people against the suffragettes. In the picture it shows them being crazy, and it says that women are sly. This is backed up by my own knowledge, because my own knowledge says that the suffragettes did crazy things such as smashing windows, and people thought that they were behaving badly and didn't deserve the vote. That would be a worse version, essentially, of this answer here, and that would get you 6 or 7 marks. But in order to get up to the higher marks for this type of question, you need to be specific to the time. So it's 1908, therefore you need to tell me what you knew, or rather know, is going on in 1908. So here it says more violence in their campaign, smashing windows, the kind of behaviour turned the people against the suffragettes, and then you can talk about as how the suffragists are worried about the impression the suffragettes are giving, and that's really what it's talking about. It's why has this been published at this particular time. It's not because people don't want women to get the vote, it's because people are reacting badly to the behaviour of the suffragettes, and that's why they've published it. So yes, they want people to stop voting for women, but the reason that they've made this particular cartoon is because of the behaviour of the women that are depicted in the cartoon. So what you need to remember for a why was the source published type of question is that it's all about the purpose at this specific time, and try to go as detailed as you can and think, okay, why was this particular cartoon or this particular source published at this particular time? Okay, question 3. Study source D. What is the message of this source? So source D is the one that we were annotating earlier, and it's the one about the women workers in the World War I. Okay, so again, you'll notice that this is a 1-paragraph answer, and that's absolutely fine. I think you know well by now that when you're answering this type of question, you're trying to get to what is it that the cartoonists want to convince people of? What were they trying to influence people to believe? So again, if you pause and take a little bit of time to read the model answer. So for this source, you might be tempted to say something like, the message of the cartoon is that women should get the vote because they're working. But you need to be a little bit more specific. So for example, this one says, the message of the cartoon is that women are the ones who are winning the war seriously. So if you were going to use the idea that women should get the vote, perhaps you would say the message of the cartoon is that women are working seriously in the war and contributing to the war effort, so therefore the cartoonist wants people to believe that women should get the vote after the war is finished. That would be acceptable, but really this cartoon is just about the fact that women are contributing to the war effort in a serious fashion at the height of the war when conscription has been introduced. Again, you need to be specific to the time, so adding in the fact that you know conscription has been introduced by 1916 is a good idea, and talking about the fact that Mrs. Pankhurst and the suffragettes decided to dedicate themselves. You could also put in things like women were part of all sorts of different things, not just munitions. You could give examples of the Wren, for example. And this would show that you've got really detailed knowledge of the time. But this answer here is very good, and if you could produce that, it's detailed, it's specific to the time, and it gives the main message of the cartoon. Okay, so you might want to take a moment to have a look at these two sources and read them through. Okay, so the two sources have got quite different tones. It's really important for this question to look at who wrote it. So this one's written by Sylvia Pankhurst, describing the war work of women in 1932. And this one is from an extract from the memoirs of an upper-class woman published in 1970. So obviously this one's written a long time after World War II, World War I, sorry, and this one's written a little while after World War I. And that's not that important. What's more important is the person who's writing it. So we've got Sylvia Pankhurst, who's a suffragette, and an upper class woman who we probably can assume isn't a suffragette. Okay, so here's the mark scheme. Have a look. You might want to take some time again to pause it and read it through. This person does a really good job of describing how, even though Sylvia Pankhurst's description is biased because of the type of language that she uses, actually it fits in more with her knowledge. And what's really important about this question is that it's how typical is it of the time. And so what you're really doing is you're saying which source fits in best with what I know went on at the time. The type of thing that should jump to mind for this is, well, people that worked in munitions factories had the yellow skin as a common side effect of making munitions, for example. And that's what you're going to focus on in your own knowledge. Okay, so the difference between the different levels on the mark scheme are essentially how well you're able to articulate what you know was going on at the time and which one matches it better. So you need to talk about the people that wrote it in order to show that you fully understand how the past is represented in each source. So you need to talk about the NOP if you're going to get 9 marks. So for this one, it's obviously the origin that they're focusing on and the two different people that wrote it and why they might be having different experiences. So you might want to say something like working class people had continued to work for many years, and so therefore the difficult conditions would be really serious for them, and you could talk about the side effects that many people felt and the bad health and safety, and the fact that Sylvia Pankhurst wants to promote the fact that women have given up a lot and have actually gone through something really, really difficult, whereas the upper class woman might be seeing this as an adventure because she doesn't normally do things like this, so it's quite different for her and quite exciting. And that's how it would be sort of sophisticated, because you're looking carefully at who wrote it and that why their point of view is different and putting that across in your answer. The main thing that you need to remember for this type of question though is make sure you put in knowledge and you say how each source fits in with the knowledge that you have, and that you have definitely done it for each source and not just said, I think source E is more typical because source E says blah, 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 and my knowledge fits with that. You must mention the other source and say why that one fits in less with what you know as well. Okay, finally on to the big one. So this is the 16-mark question that you're going to spend half an hour on. I would recommend that you actually do this question at the end of the paper. That way you'll have thought through all the sources really carefully when you've answered the previous 4 questions. It's really important that you understand what you're being asked to do. So for this one, it is 2 sides, a bit like the 10-mark question in paper 1. On the one hand, you agree, on the other hand, you disagree. So you need to say what knowledge you have is for and against the statement, which sources are for and against the statement, and how far you agree with the statement. So women are respected during the period 1890 to 1918. Note, it is the entire period, so you must mention the entire period. If you don't mention the entire period, you will not be able to get up to the top marks. What you're being asked here is whether or no men respect women and what evidence you have for and against. Okay, so when you start this, you're going to need to make a table, something a little bit like this, with for and against, and then you're going to bullet point all the facts you can think of to back up the statement, and all the bullet point all the facts you can think of that go against the statement. And then you're going to list which sources you're going to use on which side of the argument. So anything you can use to argue that women were respected would go on this side. Anything you can use to say women were not respected might go on the other side. Okay, once you've planned it out, you are ready to start answering the question. What you must do is you must make sure that you've gone over the whole period, that you start off with lots and lots of facts, and that you then include sources. Remember, this is a knowledge-based question, so you must put in lots of explanation. And just like in the 10-mark question on paper 1, you need to explain how that information backs up your point in each paragraph. So you're going to be using PEE. Okay, so for full marks, you're looking for comprehensive knowledge, which means lots and lots of knowledge. That's going to be at least 3 bits of factual information for each side of the argument, bare minimum. And you need to show that you understand their position from 1890 to 1918. And you need to make sure that you include a range of sources. And it says to make sophisticated use. So that probably means you're going to mention things like the purpose and how far they actually support you. So maybe they just support your argument a little bit. And you need to make clear that you understand how far the sources help you argue your point. You also need to make sure that you justify a valid conclusion, so that you come to a conclusion and you give a reason that that is your conclusion. Okay, so the things that are good about this answer on this side are that it starts off with how far they agree, and they say that they partially agree. So they've used a word to qualify to what extent they agree with the interpretation. So it might be I partially agree, I mainly agree, I largely agree, I to some small extent agree with the statement. You need to say how far. And then it goes on to say, however, at the beginning of the period, women were not really respected. So they're going to show that actually it changes over time. And it's very likely that the question you get asked will mean that there has been some change over time. So you might say that at one point in the period, I disagree with the statement, but at another point in the period, I actually agree with it. What this person has done is they have given some facts about how people were treated at the start of the period. You've got separate spheres, you've got mundane, not very well paid jobs, and they've used source A to back that up. And you'll notice they've just mentioned source A. They haven't actually said much about it, they've just mentioned it. And then in the next paragraph, they've then got a little bit about the suffragettes and how the behaviour of the suffragettes was disapproved of and seen as irrational. And then again, they just refer to source C as evidence for this. Then they've got many of these attitudes changed during First World War. So this is the other side of the argument. So they're going beyond what's in the sources. They're telling us about the land army and the fact that they were drivers and mechanics. And they've also got examples from source D and F to support that. So that's a really good use of mentioning the sources and talking in detail about what they know, going beyond what's actually in the sources that they could have just got about munitions factories. They've talked about other things. Okay, then they go on to talk about why women actually got the vote, and they talk about how men were impressed by the way that they had behaved in World War I. And then they conclude by saying, overall, women were far more respected at the end of the period than they were at the beginning, and so the interpretation is only partially correct. And they've gone back to the question in that last sentence. So as you can see, the sources are used to support what they are saying, and they've got detailed knowledge for both sides. I actually think that you could probably do a better job than this quick answer here on the right hand side. I think you could probably be slightly more sophisticated in the use of your sources when you're actually using them, and you could probably put in even more detail because you know lots and lots about this topic. However, the exam board is telling us that this is a very good answer. Don't forget, this is the answer that you get your SPAG marks on. It's really important that you use specialist terms, so that means use words like franchise instead of vote, and try to make sure that you're spelling things correctly as you go through. So you must check over question 5 at the end of the exam if you've got any time at all. Okay, so that's paper 2. Some more tips that I've got are that as you're going through, just think, could I include any more factual knowledge in this answer? And at the end, if you have any time left, go through each answer and try and put an extra fact into each answer and make sure that you have actually identified the purpose of the source correctly for the ones that that's important for. I'm going to stop this video here, but I will follow this up looking at the other question papers that have actually been published for 2015 and 2016 and talk you through the question types that weren't in this exam paper, but I think that's probably enough for now. On Show My Homework, you'll find this specimen paper. It's set as a homework for the date of the exam. So if you'd like to do this as a past paper and hand it in on Show My Homework or to one of our history teachers, please do so and we'll be able to give you feedback. Use this video as a guide of how to answer the questions. Good luck in the exam, and remember you need to study all 3 topics, World War I, liberal reforms and votes for women. It's really, really important that you actually make sure you study all 3, as knowledge will come in useful from each topic, even if the entire paper is on, say, liberal reforms itself. It'll be useful for you to have knowledge of the other topics to feed into that. You must study all 3 because we do not know what will come up.